Hello there everyone, and welcome to this revision video on the Elizabethans. We're going to be looking at how powerful Elizabeth I was. In this video we're going to be covering things like the Privy Council, the Elizabethan court. We're going to look at the rebellion of the Earl of Essex. We're also going to look at Elizabeth's relationship with her parliament and how she was able to control that. And then finally we're going to look at Elizabeth and her people and how she kept control of her people through things like propaganda, through things like progresses, through things like portraits, and also church services as well. And within this inquiry we're going to think about how powerful Elizabeth I actually was as an Elizabethan monarch. So let's find out more. Okay, so in this video we are going to be looking at this from the syllabus for OCR. We're going to be looking at Elizabeth and her court. We're going to look at the idea of patronage, the Privy Council, and also the rebellion of the Earl of Essex. We're also going to be talking about Elizabeth and her parliament. So we're going to be talking about opposition, particularly from the Puritans as well. And we're going to talk about Elizabeth and her people, including local government, how that worked, and also propaganda. Okay, so we're going to think about how Elizabeth used her power, and she used many different methods to keep control of her people. And these are some of the main methods and ways in which she did so. Firstly, patronage, which was giving people important positions of power and responsibility. If the nobles and gentry did not please her, she could take away their positions of power. The royal court is the term for the group of people who supported Elizabeth. It consisted of about 500 nobles, advisors and servants. A courtier was a person who attended court. The royal court is not a physical place but moved around with Elizabeth. So the most powerful courtiers were what was known as Elizabeth's Privy Council. They advised the Queen and were known as Privy Councillors. The progresses are names of the tours that Elizabeth went on to meet her people. Elizabeth had many portraits done of her to show she was England's rightful ruler and was powerful, like the Armada portrait. And Parliament, Elizabeth passed important laws and got taxation money through Parliament. She successfully managed to keep Parliament under control. Now, the royal court was the centre of Elizabethan political life. Around 500 courtiers lived with Elizabeth and worked for her. The royal court is not a place, it's a group of people. It's mobile. The court was wherever the Queen was. Courtiers were selected by the Queen and they competed for power and influence. Now, Elizabeth used the power of patronage, which is the power to appoint, and she used this to control people. Patronage, of course, caused competition amongst nobles and rivalry. It also ensured loyalty to the Queen. Now, in the summer, the Queen and her courtiers went on progresses, which are tours of the country, and it allowed the Queen to be seen. It was very much this idea of visual propaganda, and it showed off the power of the monarch. There were lavish banquets, feasts, masques, plays and tournaments that were put on to entertain the courtiers, and they glorified the Queen's image. Elizabeth needed to keep the support of a wide range of people in her court, so she used her personality and firmness to keep control. She allowed a range of people in her court. For example, a small group of Catholic noble families could attend court, so she did not lose the loyalty of Catholics. You might remember that Sir Thomas Tresham was knighted in 1575 at Kenilworth Castle. Now, the Privy Chamber, the people in the court did not have constant access to the Queen. Her own private space was called the Privy Chamber, and there she had her own servants and ladies in waiting. This private household was at the heart of the court. They had to be loyal. Elizabeth once broke the finger of a lady in waiting who married without her permission, and only her most trusted courtiers were ever invited into the Privy Chamber. So the Privy Council was really important. The Secretary of State was the Queen's main advisor and led the Privy Council. William Cecil, or Lord Burleigh, was Secretary of State from 1558 to 1572, and again from 1590 until around about his death in 1598, although Robert Cecil, his son, was stepping in as well. Francis Walsingham was Secretary of State from 1572 to 1590. Now, the Privy Council organised the work of JPs and led government departments. The Lord Treasurer controlled Elizabeth's finances and spending. The Lord High Admiral commanded the Navy, and the Lord Chamberlain ran the royal household and controlled access to Elizabeth. In terms of security, the Council protected Elizabeth and uncovered plots against her. Francis Walsingham was in charge of the spy network. They also organised England's defences to protect against invasion. In terms of policy, they advised the Queen on important policy decisions like religion and foreign policy. They helped Elizabeth to control Parliament and decide what could be debated. And in terms of propaganda, the Privy Council helped organise a positive image of the Queen through publications and portraits. Now, how did she keep control of her Privy Council? Well, she was very famous for delaying decisions or not making them. She was a very cautious ruler, and that often frustrated her Privy Councillors. She had a small team. Mary had 50 in her Privy Council, but Elizabeth limited it to 19. And there's only about 7 or 8 at most meetings. Elizabeth made sure there were good written records. She had an eye for detail, and she made her councillors keep written records to enable her to question decisions carefully. She chose the Privy Council carefully. She delayed appointing Robert Dudley for 4 years for fear of making other members jealous. She chose members with different opinions so she could listen to all sides and make the final decision. She rewarded them with patronage, like William Cecil being made Lord Burleigh or Robert Dudley being made the Earl of Leicester. But there were harsh punishments for rebels such as the Earl of Essex, who was executed after his failed rebellion. So one thing to really hone in on when you're looking at the Privy Council is William Cecil and Sir Francis Walsingham, who were the two Secretaries of State. Now, William Cecil was Secretary of State from 1558 to 1572 and also 1590 to 1598. He was Lord Treasurer from 1572 until 1590. Sir Francis Walsingham was Secretary of State from 1572 to 1590. So in terms of William Cecil, he's from a gentry family. He was a well-educated lawyer. He was a moderate Protestant but sympathetic to Puritans. He was keen to crack down on Catholics, and he wanted to avoid any foreign wars. He was intelligent, serious and thoughtful. Elizabeth called him her spirit. She changed Elizabeth's mind on key issues such as the need to execute Mary Queen of Scots in 1587. Elizabeth trusted him more than any other advisor but refused to see him for months in 1587 after the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. He died in 1598, and Elizabeth was reported to have wept bitterly at the news of his death. His son Robert took over. Now, Francis Walsingham was a well-educated lawyer. He spoke many languages. He was a strong Puritan, believed Catholics were a threat and must be repressed. He wanted to support Protestant rebels in Scotland and the Netherlands so they would be allies against Catholic Spain. He was a cold and distant character. He never tried to flatter the Queen, and he was nicknamed the Moor. He believed he was a servant of the state, not of the Queen, and he persuaded her to drop her plan to marry the Duke of Anjou in 1580. The Queen wanted to throw a slipper at his head when he dared to criticise her, and he died of exhaustion in 1590. Okay, now one of the things to understand is that Elizabeth's loyal group of ministers changed in the 1590s. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, died in 1588. Sir Francis Walsingham died in 1590. Christopher Hatton died in 1591. Remember, the Golden Hind was named after Sir Christopher Hatton. And remember, his Gideon tapestries were sold to Bess of Hardwick for Hardwick Hall, if you remember. William Cecil Lord Burleigh died in 1598, and the ageing Elizabeth I became a symbol of England's decline in the 1590s and this troubled decade in the 1590s. You might remember the poor harvests in the mid-1590s, 1594 to 1597. So the young guns come in, and there are new figures at court, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, and Robert Cecil, who is, of course, the son of Lord Burleigh. And that's going to take us into thinking about Essex's rebellion now. Now, in the Privy Council in the 1590s, there's great rivalry between Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, and Robert Cecil. Now, the Earl of Essex, he's appointed to the Privy Council in 1593. He's young, he's eloquent, he's good-looking, he's a favourite of Elizabeth, and he's popular with the people. But he's also ambitious and arrogant and short-tempered. He's a military hero. He fought in the Netherlands, France, and Spain. And he angered Elizabeth by joining Drake's failed attack on Lisbon in 1589. He married without permission in 1590. He eventually joined the Privy Council in 1593, as we've seen, but he was often disrespectful towards Elizabeth, and he hated the Cecil family. Robert Cecil, very different kind of character, very clever, very sharp, less of a military figure, appointed to the Privy Council in 1591. He's the son of William Cecil. He took on a heavy workload as his father aged. He was trained by his father and Walsingham in the art of spying. He was a very shrewd and subtle politician. Okay, so we're going to really focus in on Essex's rebellion, and this is a really good case study in Elizabeth's power, so it's a great story to know about and really delve into. Okay, so the Earl of Essex was ambitious. He wanted to be England's main advisor. He wanted to be Secretary of State. He wanted all the power. In 1596, he led a successful attack on the Spanish port of Cadiz. He destroyed warships and he returned to England as a hero. The crowds were cheering his name. There was a service for him in St. Paul's Cathedral where crowds were cheering his name. So he was incredibly popular. But while he was away, Elizabeth made Robert Cecil his Secretary of State. And on returning, Essex insulted Elizabeth and he turned his back on her. Elizabeth punched him on the ear and Essex almost drew his sword. He half drew his sword and he stormed out of the meeting. And as a result of this, Essex was banned from court. Now, eventually, Essex tried to regain his reputation, and he was sent to Ireland in 1599 to crush a Catholic rebellion. But he went against Elizabeth's orders, and he made peace with the rebels, and Elizabeth was furious. And this was a very much a failure, this expedition. 12,000 soldiers died of disease, didn't really achieve much. And when Essex returned, he stormed into her privy chamber at Nonsuch Palace, and as a result she banned him from court, took away his government jobs, and eventually got rid of his monopoly on sweet wines. Essex was ruined. So Essex decides to rebel. So he gathers together 300 supporters, including unhappy soldiers, some unhappy nobles, for example, some papists, some Catholics, and his plan is to seize the Queen and remove Robert Cecil from court. Now, rumours of Essex's plan spread through London. Now, on the 7th of February 1601, Essex's supporters put on a performance of Shakespeare's play Richard II at the Globe Theatre, and it includes the scene where, of course, the king is overthrown. The whole play, Richard II, is about the rise and fall of a king. So the message was really, really clear that Essex was basically comparing Elizabeth I to Richard II. So Elizabeth was furious, and she summoned Essex to court. Now, Essex refuses to appear before the Privy Council, so 4 Privy Councillors are sent to his home to arrest him, but Essex takes them hostage. Essex then marches into London with his supporters. The Privy Council, though, declare him a traitor, and his supporters begin to surrender. And this is a really good example of how the people do stay loyal to the Queen when they are given the choice of whether to do so. And that is really good evidence to show the power of Elizabeth's propaganda. Essex's position was weakened. He decided to return home. Soldiers were sent to block his route home, and there was some fighting, but Essex managed to escape home by the River Thames. And when he got to his home, which is called Essex House on the River Thames, he found the hostages had been released and armed soldiers were surrounding his home. Essex surrendered. The rebellion had lasted just 12 hours. He was put on trial just a few days later, found guilty of treason, and executed at the Tower of London only 17 days later on the 25th of February 1601. It's said that it took 3 blows of the axe to get his head off. The ending of the rebellion, of course, showed that Elizabeth was weakened but still in control. So what are the takeaways that we can get from the story of Earl of Essex? Well, I think it shows that Elizabeth was powerful because she could play rivals off against each other. This is classic Elizabeth. Here, of course, Essex and Robert Cecil compete for power. It shows Elizabeth had a strong and forceful personality. She struck Essex on the ear when he showed disrespect. It showed that Elizabeth cleverly used patronage to control courtiers, such as removing Essex's right to collect tax and his monopoly on sweet wines. She had the power to ruin him financially. Despite Essex being a popular figure, the people remained loyal to her when he rebelled. This shows that propaganda and the idea of her power coming from God had worked. Elizabeth was also ruthless towards opponents. Despite being one of her favourite courtiers, he was executed only 17 days after his rebellion. It shows that Elizabeth often used terror to control people, like, for example, what happened to Edmund Campion or what happened to Margaret Clitheroe that you learned about in the Catholics' Inquiry. But Elizabeth was not powerful because, although not successful, Essex did manage to mount a significant rebellion against her involving over 300 rebels. It showed that the succession crisis sometimes left Elizabeth vulnerable because Essex used the succession crisis and his links with James VI to conspire against her. It was similar to the Catholic rebellions that we are going to be learning about. The Earl of Essex was able to regain his power on occasions despite defying Elizabeth many times, such as through his marriage where he didn't get permission or turning his back on her. So it's a great case study to use the story of the Earl of Essex as an example in any kind of exam question about how powerful Elizabeth I was. Okay, we're now going to look at Elizabeth and her parliament, including Puritan opposition. So Parliament had much less power than it does today. It was not democratic. The Queen ruled mostly through issuing royal orders, or what are called royal proclamations. If Elizabeth wanted to change the law or raise taxes, she called Parliament. The Queen could open and close Parliament whenever she wished to. MPs were not elected but were instead selected by local lords. Parliament sat for only 35 months of Elizabeth's 45-year reign and only met 13 times. But between 1580 and 1603, Elizabeth called Parliament more often than previously because she needed laws and financial support to deal with religious threats and war with Spain. Elizabeth and her ministers also decided what Parliament could discuss. Privy Councillors organised parliamentary business, some served as MPs. The Queen appointed the Speaker who decided on what could be discussed. Topics such as religion, marriage, foreign affairs and succession could not be discussed. Now, one of the interesting things is that Elizabeth faced more opposition from Puritan MPs. Some MPs grew in confidence and started to discuss topics that had been off limits. Privy councillors like Cecil and Walsingham focused on foreign policy or the succession, which they wanted Elizabeth to focus on. So sometimes her privy councillors, like Cecil and Walsingham, could actually use Parliament to try and get Elizabeth to think about things that she wanted them to. Puritans wanted freedom of speech for MPs. Puritans wanted Elizabeth to marry a Protestant prince and to make arrangements for a Protestant successor. Puritans also wanted Elizabeth to allow church groups to choose their own leaders. This idea is called Presbyterianism. Now, some good case studies of Puritan opposition are John Stubbs and Peter Wentworth. In November 1579, a Puritan called John Stubbs wrote a pamphlet criticising Elizabeth for considering marrying a French Catholic called the Duke of Anjou. Stubbs was arrested and he had his hand cut off. Stubbs was imprisoned, and on his release in 1581 he carried on writing, and in 1589 he became an MP and criticised Elizabeth in Parliament. However, his criticisms were never treasonous. He never talked of replacing Elizabeth with another monarch, unlike the Catholics. In 1584 and 1586, Puritan MPs demanded the Church of England get rid of bishops, but Elizabeth banned the debate. When 3 MPs discussed it outside Parliament, she had them imprisoned for a month. Also, 2 Suffolk Puritans were hanged in 1583 for spreading similar views. In 1593, Puritan MP Peter Wentworth urged Elizabeth to name a Protestant successor. Elizabeth imprisoned him in the Tower of London, where he remained until his death in 1597. Okay, so if you want some examples of complaints from Parliament, you've got purveyances and monopoly. So really a lot around money. In 1589, MPs complained about purveyances, which is the Queen's right to buy supplies at cheap prices. Elizabeth said that this did not concern MPs, but that she would look into their complaints. In 1597, there was concern about monopolies. A monopoly was the exclusive right to make or sell a product. Elizabeth had the right to sell a monopoly to a favourite courtier. For example, she granted Walter Raleigh a monopoly in tin. The Earl of Essex had one for sweet wines. MPs complained about monopolies in the 1597 Parliament. The Queen agreed to look into the issue but did not take action. Now, monopolies come back in 1601. Elizabeth had done little about monopolies and MPs complained again, much more forcefully. There was more opposition from MPs on this than on any other issue at any other time in Elizabeth's reign. Now, Elizabeth knew she had to compromise, and she made the golden speech to Parliament, flattering MPs and reinforcing how much she loved her people. She did cancel some monopolies and promised to look into others. Okay, so we're just going to have a little look at the extract from an MP's account from Elizabeth's Golden Speech. An extract from an MP's account. It says, "I do assure you there is no prince that loves his subjects better. No queen will ever sit in my seat with more zeal to my country or care for my subjects, or who will sooner with willingness venture her life for your good and safety than myself. For it is my desire neither to live nor reign longer than my life, and reign shall be for your good. And though you have had and may have many princes more mighty and wise sitting in this seat, yet you never had nor shall have any that will be more careful and loving." So this is the MP's account of Elizabeth's Golden Speech. It showed that she could use flattery and charm to control Parliament. The speech was printed by the Privy Council and issued for anyone to read. Okay, we're now going to look at local government and propaganda, and we're going to talk about Lord Lieutenants and Justice of the Peace. So obviously in local areas, Elizabeth has to rule through her people. So in terms of Lord Lieutenants, there was one per county, and they had the responsibility for each county and ensuring that people obeyed Elizabeth's laws. Elizabeth usually chose the most powerful noble in each area for this role, and she told the Privy Council of any local problems. They would also provide the Queen with part-time soldiers when required. Now, JPs are Justices of the Peace. There's probably around about 40 per county, and they very much keep the country running. They're usually selected from educated gentry families. They're unpaid, but people watch to do this job because it gave a man considerable local power. A 1600-page book written by William Lambard, a JP in Kent, is an important source for telling us about their work. They enforce poor laws, collect taxes, set wages, and arrange road repairs. Every quarter, 3 months, they held sessions where they judged criminal cases. Now, some JPs were lazy, but others favoured powerful families or ignored Catholic practices. Elizabeth could dismiss JPs who failed to do their duties. Now, Elizabeth used an awful lot of propaganda to present a strong image of herself to keep her subjects loyal. You know, this idea, for example, of the Virgin Queen, the Golden Age, this idea of a Gloriana, are all kind of powerful images that still actually persist in terms of Elizabeth's image. And she does it through lots of things beginning with P. So there are progresses. Every summer, Elizabeth and her court stayed with nobles who attempted to impress the Queen. Elizabeth was regularly seen by her most powerful subjects. There were pageants. For example, a session day on the 17th of November each year was the day to celebrate Elizabeth becoming Queen. Local communities rang bells, there were church services, and they lit bonfires. Preachers had to have a government licence. The Queen selected church leaders who would be loyal and preach from the pulpit about how Elizabeth was the rightful Queen and the idea of the divine right. Plays were performed at court showing the importance of monarchy and hierarchy, and any plays that she didn't like would be censored and banned. Publications, books were published on topics such as the Elizabeth's Golden Speech or the poem The Fairy Queen, for example. Pennies, Elizabeth's image was on all of the coins, allowing her people to see her image. And prayers, people had to attend church every week, and services included the prayer for the Queen's memory, which reinforced Elizabeth's position as divinely appointed. Now, portraits were a really important example of creating this idea of a golden age. Elizabeth's courtiers were expected to wear miniature portraits of her, and we can see here just 4 examples of portraits for you to remember. The Phoenix portrait, painted in 1575, along with a pelican portrait. The phoenix is a mythical bird which rises from the ashes. The pelican portrait, according to legend, the pelican pecks at its own breast to feed her young on her own blood so they can live. And this was the idea of Elizabeth sacrificing herself for the good of the people. The rainbow portrait, produced near the end of Elizabeth's life. She is wearing pearls, holding a rainbow in her hand. Her cloak is covered with eyes and ears, and her dress in flowers, all symbolises her power and importance. And again, the Armada portrait, which is produced to celebrate the Spanish Armada, again is a real expression of the power of Elizabeth I and her victory over the Spanish. And that, combined with the speech that she made at Tilbury, for example, they very much cultivate this image that the Spanish Armada is Elizabeth's victory. Now, Elizabeth also used censorship to ensure loyalty and discourage criticism. She saw plans for plays in advance so she could cut anything out that she did not like, and the Privy Council helped with this as well. There were only 60 printing presses in England, so the Privy Council could easily prevent publications they disapproved of. Images used in portraits were carefully controlled. In 1596, a new template was introduced for artists to copy, which showed her younger than she was and hid the fact that she had decaying teeth and a wig. The Privy Council ordered unacceptable portraits to be burned. Okay, so thank you for watching that revision video about how powerful Elizabeth I was. I hope you've enjoyed that, and good luck with your exams.